Welcome to the Hourly Podcast. In today's episode, Jim Taylor, founder and CEO at Benchmark 60 Restaurant Services and partner at Le Crocodile restaurant in Vancouver, discusses the importance of understanding labor models and managing workload in restaurants. He explains how measuring workload, similar to professional sports, can help prevent burnout and improve performance. Jim also emphasizes the need to focus on dollar contribution rather than just percentage costs when managing food costs. Overall, Jim shares insights throughout the episode on how restaurant owners and operators can optimize their business models for profitability and employee satisfaction. Enjoy.
This episode is brought to you by JoJo, an AI virtual recruiter powered by Sprockets. Designed for the hourly workforce, JoJo works 24/7 to source, screen, and schedule interviews with the best applicants for your business. JoJo helps reduce employee turnover and time spent hiring so you and your team can focus on other important tasks. To learn more, head to sprockets.ai/JoJo.
No, man, I'm glad we were able to get back on the podcast, and huge fan of yours. I've been following you on LinkedIn for a while, and
thank you.
Thanks for coming on the pod.
Anytime, man. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'll follow your lead.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about Jim. What do you do? Who are you for someone who's never heard your name before?
Yeah, do a whole bunch of different stuff, but predominantly in the restaurant space. I've been in the industry my whole life. I was the 12-year-old whose parents taught me to open bottles of wine and beer so I could bartend their Christmas party as a 12-year-old, right? I was that kid. And I never really left the industry. I started working in restaurants when I was 15. I did the corporate operations thing, climbed the ladder in a big Canadian restaurant brand. I was with them for just over 20 years. Left in the middle of the first year of the pandemic because I wanted to try to find a way to help. And now fast forward a few years, we have an agency that works with restaurant groups, owners, operators all over North America and a little bit in the UK to help them better understand what's happening with their labor model, so they can stay ahead of all of the different changes that are going on with wages and pricing models and inflation and all this different stuff, because that labor model is becoming more and more complex all the time.
Yeah, I mean, if you feel comfortable, share a little bit more about like why you left that job, right? You said like, hey, like you want to make more of an impact. Like, talk to me about that.
To be honest, it was just one of those. I was on 100 flights in 2019. And so when the pandemic hit, I mean, the silver lining of that whole terrible thing for me was that I didn't have to get on an airplane anymore. And I realized that there was more to life than airplanes and hotels. But I had some friends who owned restaurants and they were really, really struggling. And so the combination of a few of those things, I thought, you know what, I just need a break. I want to try and help. I'm not sure what it looks like yet, but I felt like I'd had a wealth of experience doing all kinds of different things in the corporate world. And I just wanted to try to find a way to help the industry that I've grown up in. So took the leap.
Yeah. What was your first contract out of that? Was it like a friend's restaurant? Was it, was it successful? Kind of what were your thoughts around that?
It was a friend's restaurant that they were doing friends and family for their brand new opening, first restaurant that they'd ever owned. They were doing friends and family when the shutdowns happened. So they had no government help. They had no subsidy. They were just opened straight into takeout only. And it just happened that the woman who owned the restaurant, she'd never even been the general manager of a restaurant, let alone the owner of a restaurant. So she was trying to figure out how to run a business while at the same time navigate everything that was going on. And so I just tried to help however I could.
Yeah. So like when you approach a company or somebody contracts you, what are some like very basic but like prevalent trends of what they're getting wrong about people? Like what's obvious to you that's not obvious to everybody else?
Well, we help operators understand, and this isn't a pitch. This is a real thing that happens in restaurants every day. The part of the world that kind of has it really figured out, though, is the pro sport world. Professional sports measure workload. They measure time on the field. They measure time on the pitch or whatever sport it might be, right? And what they're trying to do is prevent burnout and injury for their athletes so that they can perform, right? So they can sell tickets and jerseys and all that other stuff. And we found that from a data perspective in restaurants, you can do the same thing. So that's one thing that we talk about so much is we can proactively prevent burnout in restaurants just by looking at levels of workload and how hard the team has to work in order to accomplish what it is that the restaurant owner is trying to accomplish.
Interesting.
And
So how do you do that kind of practically and tactically? Is it through
yeah,
a panel system? Is it through a specific app? Like, talk to me a little bit about
no,
management.
it's well, a lot of restaurants will look at productivity and efficiency metrics, right? So a restaurant might look at sales per labor hour as a metric of how what the output of the restaurant is, right? But what they a lot of times don't understand is that there's sort of an invisible threshold there where this productivity metric that they're measuring, sales per labor hour, covers per labor hour, something like that, it it's good when it's good, and it's good when it's, if it's improving, things are moving forward, it's probably helping the business be more profitable. But there's this invisible threshold that when you cross it, we call that unsustainable workload levels. And it's
Oh,
crazy to see the connective points that go along with that. So we might see a restaurant that's operating really high in terms of a certain productivity metric, and all of a sudden we'll see Google reviews start to decline, employee turnover starts to increase, people are calling in sick more often, average guest check is declining. And it's all these signals that are showing that the workload's too much, the staff can't handle it.
interesting. And so, like, when you go in, like, percentage wise, even just
Mhm.
rough numbers, how
Sure.
often is it they're understaffed and they need more people versus maybe just asking people to do too much when they're on the shift and like they don't have the tools required to be productive at work.
It's probably about 50-50. I mean, and it depends on the market and the season, right? But a lot
Interesting.
of times it's based on the fact that the current employee in restaurants has different expectations than they did 5 years ago.
Right.
They have different limits on what they're willing to do. They have different expectations. They have different levels of understanding and experience. There's all these different things that go into it, right? So, I mean, that threshold could be different now than it was in 2019, just because employees are less experienced or less conditioned or whatever you want to call it. But we see it happen all the time. And sometimes we're short staffed and we're trying to cover the whole, open the whole restaurant, and our team's spread thin. We help
Yep.
them understand that shrinking the space intentionally might actually increase average guest check and benefit the business.
Mhm.
Sometimes we're just pushing the team too hard. We think they can do 200 covers, but they can only do 150, and it's actually, having the adverse effect on what they want the business to do. There's all kinds of different scenarios, but one way or another, from a data perspective, we can help them understand it.
Yeah, there's so much there, right? And of course,
Yeah,
like, I'm a big proponent of like the money ball when it comes to sports.
for
And like one
sure.
of my favorite episodes we had, and it hasn't gotten released yet, but I'm really excited for it, is when somebody talked about they did a step counter for all of their wait staff.
Yeah.
And what they thought was that everyone was going to have the same amount of steps. But the problem was that the people who were the furthest in the restaurant had like twice as many steps as the person who
Hmm.
was closest to the kitchen.
Hmm.
Now, the challenge with that was that they had the same amount of tables.
Yeah.
So it's like you have to walk twice as much. You're not able to physically be in more areas, yet
Yeah.
the comment like the without looking at the data, you just assume like, hey, you get 5 tables, you get 5 tables, you get 7 tables, you get 7 tables, but it couldn't work in this big venue, which I thought was so fascinating, right? And
Yeah.
it's one of those things where it's like the more data we get, the better, but it's so hard to track everything and know where to look,
Hmm.
right? Because it's just you don't want to create data for data's sake.
Of
Like
course.
data without action is inactionable data, which is worthless to most, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like where do you draw the line? Like how do you encourage people to learn more about their business, but actually be able to do something?
Well, we try to simplify it for them. So we help them quite often. My recommendation is to look at covers per labor hour as literally, if you look at nothing else in the whole business, just look at that. Because if we look at that metric, it gives us a ratio, right? How hard does the team have to work to serve the number of customers that are coming through the restaurant? So it'll tell us
Right.
if we want to know why the restaurant is increasing in profit or decreasing in profit. Well, that's one metric, but it'll also force us to look at average guest check, average employee wage, number of hours that people are working. So it just helps us compartmentalize things,
Yeah.
right? But it also is a metric of workload. So we can say, hey, look, the labor costs looked really, really good last week, but that covers per labor hour number was double what it normally is. Well, that's actually how many people the team is having to serve and how hard they're having to work, right? So we try to help sort of dumb things down a little bit and simplify it. Just say look at 3 or 4 core pieces of information, and it'll really help make decisions easier throughout the whole business. Because you're right, there's so much information that exists out there, especially as the the technology continues to, every month there's a new piece of tech that can be used in a restaurant, right? So there's a little bit of burnout happening for operators there too.
And is that like a proprietary benchmark 60 ratio that you guys have designed, or is that pretty standard across the industry? And if so, if I stopped at 100 restaurants today, how many people could tell me what their ratio is?
0.
But is it an industry term? Would you know what it is?
It is a little bit. So the biggest, best in the world use it. McDonald's looks at it, right? Yeah. So some of the biggest, best restaurants in the world that understand how productivity affects their business model, they look at that metric. If you went to 100 restaurants in your neighborhood today, probably 30 to 50 of them probably look at sales per labor hour.
Yeah.
But it can be a misleading metric, right? Because if you sit down in a restaurant and order filet mignon and a bottle of Cabernet, and I sit at the table next to you and order a glass of water, a bowl of soup, the sales per labor hour associated with our two experiences are completely different, right? So it's hard to control.
That swings so much, especially in a small venue with limited reservations, right?
Sure. And it's just hard for the operator to control that number.
Interesting. So when you first approach a company or they approach you, you bring them through this model, you start to track it. And then over time, you constantly come back to it and press them and give suggestions of how to improve it. Is that kind of the
yeah. Model? So we would, let's say a company comes to us and says, hey, we're having a hard time. This discussion comes up a lot this time of year heading into the fall, right? Especially in the northern half of North America, right? As we call it seasonal spike. You start to see things like labor costs spike in the fall. And it's because the business model is changing, right? People act differently when summer's over. They eat different meals. They go out at different times. They, all these different things. And the whole employee side of things changes. The turnover goes through the roof as kids go back to school and all these different things happen, right? So we would look at it and say, okay, let's just find out what's happening now. What's currently happening, even though this isn't something you normally look at. And then we would say, okay, well, what would happen if we could move the needle by 5%? And a restaurant that does $3 million a year in revenue, a 5% improvement in that covers per labor hour metric, depending on their pricing and wage model, it could be $50,000 or $60,000 straight to the bottom line.
Wow. Yeah.
Right. And then you factor in things like if the workload is too high and we actually try to bring it down a little bit, you might reduce your turnover by 10, 20, 30%, right? Which saves a ton of money. So there's so many things that can go into that. And I always find that metric just helps to shine a light really quickly on areas of opportunity.
Yeah. Cause I also think too, when you first go in, and I'm assuming that this is a metric that you could backdate, right?
For sure. We can look back as far as we want.
You can look at the revenues, then you can look at the hours, and you can kind of calculate it over a period of time. Right. And when you do that, is it usually when you're not measuring it pretty volatile? Or is it's volatile? Okay. So at the very minimum, being able to bring it to awareness and I don't want to say standardize, but create a target and kind of flatten that out. That's more valuable than right now because they're not measuring it. It's probably boom, 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 right?
Bang on.
Super interesting.
And that's one of the opportunities that comes up, right? Because if you look at that data line and it's all over the place, that anecdotally, but also in real life, that's representing guest experience, employee experience, profitability, revenue. It's in one way or another representing a whole bunch of different things, right? So if we can flatten that line out, employee experience becomes more predictable, profit becomes easier to manage, guest experience becomes more consistent, all of those things. And yeah, we can set a target and say, here's where what we're trying to get to.
Yeah.
And if we like it and things are going smooth, then once we get it flattened out, let's try and increase it a little bit. More money to the bottom line.
Because I'm assuming too that once you have that flattened out and you've established what the unit economics are that you're chasing, that's also easier to expand units, right?
Absolutely.
Because right now, I think there's a tendency when things are feeling good, going good for you to, and everybody's natural inclination is let's start another restaurant, let's do another concept, and it's whoa, maybe this is a one-off thing and we might not have the unit economics in order to support it for restaurant 2, 4, 6, 12, 24.
For sure.
So interesting. Interesting. So what else other than covers per labor hour, which is something that
Yeah.
I just learned. So thank you for that.
You're
What's
welcome.
another big thing that you look at and constantly comes up when you're dealing with your customer base?
Well, most of the work that we do is related to labor model, right? Most of it is sort of in that lane, but a lot of times things sort of closely connected to that come up, right? The other half of prime cost in a restaurant is cost of goods. So quite often there's questions that come up about cost of goods, and we focus really heavily. And I learned a lot about this through my career and stumbled through different scenarios when they, based on different locations and menus and all this different stuff. But we try to really make sure that we shine a light on the importance of an operator focusing on dollar contribution and not just percentage cost. The industry gets stuck quite often on managing food cost percentage, for example. I want to have a 25% food cost menu or a 30% food cost menu. But I would rather sell a 50% food cost item that makes $20 every time I sell one than a 25% food cost that makes $5 every time I sell one.
Interesting.
Right?
And when you say that to somebody that's been in the restaurant business for 10 years, what's their reaction to that typically?
Well, it's quite often when you start to talk about dollars to the bottom line, I mean, it's an easy way to sort of help that resonate. But because the restaurant industry is so well known around being a low margin business, right? I mean, a good restaurant right now might be making, if they make 15% net at the end of the year, I mean, they're in very good shape. We talk to operators all the time that are in the 5 to 8% range. So if I say to them, I want you to take your food cost percentage from 25% to 30% on purpose, they might go, well, there goes my 5% net profit. Right. But if we can translate it into dollars and help that conversation be a bit more palatable, it makes more sense. And the other side of that food cost thing is it's actually more important to manage the variance between actual food cost and theoretical food cost than it is to just chase that percentage.
What is the difference between those two things?
So if I write a menu and I say, I want my food cost to be 25%, right? I write a menu, I calculate all the different items and their food cost percentage, and I come to an average, right? The whole menu is costed at 25%, right? But if all the staff are eating every day for free and not accounting for their meals, and there's a bunch of waste happening, and the yield on the red peppers isn't what we want it to be, all these different things going on, the actual food cost might be 30% when at the end of the day. So we encourage restaurants to manage the variance between the two, because that's about creating systems that manage the profitability.
Yeah, and what is the typical variance for a restaurant that's not keeping track of it right now? Like,
you're actually the third person,
high, right? Like,
you're actually the third person today to ask me that question. So it's a good question.
Like, hey, I'm doing something right. Yeah. It must be a good question, right?
The best companies that we see get it down to 1.5%. So their theoretical food cost might be 25, their actual is 26.
And then what's the worst?
10.
And that's like when people are doing family meal, people are doing bad stuff with vendors.
Totally. Someone's taking a case of steaks out the back door. There's all kinds of stuff, just control happening, right? And so here they are thinking, I have a 25% food cost. Well, they don't. They have a 35% food cost.
Super interesting. But we are coming up on time.
Yeah, all good.
We're going to have to do like 3 or 4 of these, part 1, part 2, part 3.
Anytime.
To dig into this. But I ask everybody this question, and you've kind of already answered it, but I'll do it just for continuity's sake. What was your first paid hourly job? And were you fired from that job or decide to elegantly leave?
Interesting. My first paid hourly job was at a restaurant in Calgary, Alberta called Earl's. It was a busboy. And I resigned from that job.
Okay, I like it. And then if somebody wants to get in touch with you, learn more about the company, what's the best way to do it? And what do you love to talk about with new people?
Well, I have kind of a rule of thumb. I'll never say no to a conversation. I'll talk to anybody. But the best way to get a hold of me is definitely on LinkedIn. We spend a lot of time there and generate lots of good content. And I mean, anything restaurant business model related, right? We don't write menus for companies. We don't design restaurants or do any of that kind of stuff, but anything business model, cost of goods, labor management, profitability, any of that kind of stuff. That's what we talk about all day, every day, pretty much. So
Awesome, man. Well, hey, thanks so much for being on the pod. We'll have to catch up soon.
My pleasure. Take care.